The submersible's hull creaked under pressure as I guided it deeper beneath the Ross ice shelf. The instrument panel cast a blue glow across my face, the only real light down here where Antarctica's massive ice sheet met the frigid ocean. I checked my coordinates again, making sure I was still on track toward the anomaly Molly had pointed out during this morning's briefing. Control. This is Polar Diver. I'm at position N7, heading toward the marked coordinates, I said into my radio. Current depth 180 meters below shelf. The radio crackled briefly before my brother's voice came through. Copy that, Adam. How's visibility? About what you'd expect, I replied, adjusting the external lights. 5 meters of murky blue, then nothing but darkness and ice. The submersible was small but sturdy, a reinforced titanium hull with acrylic viewports designed specifically for these under-ice missions. After 15 years studying glaciers, I'd spent my fair share of time in vessels like this one, but something felt different today. Molly had been unusually cryptic during the briefing, mentioning only that satellite thermal imaging had picked up something worth investigating. I checked the ice thickness scanner, watching the readout as the shelf above me varied between 30 and 40 meters thick. Pretty standard for this section of the Ross. The external temperature gauge read minus 1.9 degrees Celsius, right at the freezing point of salt water. "Hey Grant," I said into the radio. "Tell Molly these readings look normal so far. Nothing unusual in the ice structure." "She's right here," Grant replied. "Says to keep going another half-kilometer toward those coordinates." I pushed forward on the throttle, feeling the gentle surge as the propellers spun faster. The beams from my external lights carved twin cones through the darkness, occasionally catching swarms of krill or the sleek form of a fish darting away. The first sign something was off came when the temperature gauge ticked upward, just 1/10 of a degree, but enough to make me notice. Control. I'm registering a slight temperature increase, up to minus 1.8. "That's within normal variance," Grant replied. "Maybe," I said, unconvinced. "The water here should be at a constant temperature. Even tiny variations meant something was happening." As I pushed deeper toward the coordinates, the temperature continued to rise, minus 1.7, minus 1.6. When it hit minus 1.2, I sat up straighter in my seat. "Control, I'm definitely registering a warm current. Temperature's climbing steadily." "How much?" Molly's voice had replaced Grant's on the radio. "We're at minus 1.2 and rising. That shouldn't be possible this deep under the shelf." I watched the external thermometer with growing concern. This isn't normal. There shouldn't be warm water currents here. Nothing that would raise ambient temperature by this much. The submersible drifted into the warmer water, and I felt a slight pull from the current. Nothing alarming yet, just a gentle tug against the hull. "I'm feeling a current now," I reported, making a small adjustment with the thrusters to maintain position, pulling me eastward toward the target coordinates. "What's your read on it?" Molly asked. I checked the instruments, frowning at the readings. "It's localized, not part of any current system I recognize. Temperature's up to minus 0.8 now." The water around me had changed. What had been clear blue was now clouded with silt and microparticles, swirling in the beams of my lights. The current was stirring up the seafloor. "I'm going to try to get closer to the source," I said, easing the submersible forward. That was my first mistake. The current suddenly intensified, grabbing the submersible like an invisible hand. What had been a gentle tug became a firm pull, dragging me toward a section of ice I hadn't planned to approach. "Control. Current strength just jumped," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm being pulled off course." I pushed the throttle in reverse, fighting against the pull, but the engines whined in protest as the current grew even stronger. "Adam? What's happening?" Grant's voice had an edge to it now. The current, it's much stronger than expected. I cranked the throttle to maximum reverse, but the submersible continued moving forward. Engines at full reverse, but I'm still being pulled in. The navigation display showed me drifting rapidly toward a thicker section of the ice shelf. The water temperature had risen to minus 0.2 degrees, warm enough to melt ice. Control. I think I know what's happening, I said, my fingers flying over the controls as I tried to stabilize. There's a warm water channel cutting through the ice. It's creating suction as the water flows through, like a drain. Get out of there, Adam, Molly ordered. Full power to lateral thrusters. Try to get clear of the current. I did as instructed, diverting power to the side thrusters, trying to slide out of the current's grip. For a moment, it seemed to work. The submersible angled slightly away from the direct pull. But then the current shifted, swirling around me like a whirlpool, and I lost what little control I had. It's not working, I reported. A cold knot forming in my stomach as the reality of the situation sank in. Current's too strong. I can't break free. Through the viewport, I watched as the submersible was dragged toward what looked like a dark crevice in the underside of the ice shelf. The opening wasn't visible on any of our maps or scans. It shouldn't exist. Grant, I said, hearing the tension in my own voice. Something's pulling me under a section of the shelf. There's a tunnel or channel in the ice. I'm being sucked into it. Adam, listen to me. Grant's voice was tightly controlled. Shut down main power and divert everything to life support. If you get trapped, you'll need to conserve. The radio cut out as the submersible was yanked into the narrow passage. Darkness enveloped me as ice surrounded the vessel on all sides. The external lights illuminated a twisting tunnel of blue-white ice, rushing past at alarming speed. Warning alarms blared as the navigation system lost its satellite connection. The depth gauge spun wildly, unable to get an accurate reading as the submersible tumbled through the powerful current. I grabbed the manual controls, trying to keep the vessel from smashing against the ice walls. But it was like trying to steer a leaf in a storm drain. The passage narrowed, scraping against the hull with a horrible screeching noise. I braced myself, certain the pressure would crush the submersible at any moment. My breathing came in short, sharp gasps as I fought to maintain some semblance of control. "Come on," I muttered, wrestling with the unresponsive controls. "Come on." For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I was completely helpless, carried along by forces I couldn't fight. The tunnel twisted and turned, diving deeper beneath the ice shelf. The temperature gauge continued to rise, now reading a full degree above freezing, impossible for Antarctic waters. Then, just as suddenly as it had grabbed me, the current released its grip. The submersible burst from the narrow passage into something else, something open. The violent tumbling stopped, and I found myself floating freely. I leaned forward, wiping condensation from the inside of the viewport, and froze in disbelief. Stretching out before me was an enormous cavern beneath the ice. But that wasn't what made me doubt my own eyes. It was the light, a soft blue-green glow that illuminated the entire space, revealing a vast underwater chamber bigger than any cave system I'd ever seen or read about. The ceiling was ice, but not the opaque white of the shelf. This ice was clear in places, textured in others, forming crystalline structures that caught and refracted the mysterious light. And the source of that light, I couldn't tell. It seemed to come from deeper within the cavern, from something hidden beyond the range of my vision, something that couldn't, exist beneath 2,000 feet of Antarctic ice. The cavern stretched out before me, its vastness beyond what I could have imagined from outside the ice shelf. I sat motionless in my seat for several minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. The submersible drifted gently in the open water, rotating slowly as currents pushed it in a lazy circle. This gave me a panoramic view of my surroundings, a massive underwater chamber that shouldn't exist. I checked the depth gauge, 153 meters below the surface of the Ross Ice Shelf. The temperature gauge showed 1 degree Celsius, impossible for Antarctic waters, which should have been nearly 2 degrees below freezing at this depth. As the submersible completed its slow rotation, I spotted the source of the strange illumination. It wasn't the blue-green bioluminescence I'd initially assumed. The cavern floor, visible now about 30 meters below me, was dotted with what looked like underwater hot springs. Geothermal vents releasing streams of bubbles and casting an orange glow throughout the chamber. That explains the temperature, I said aloud to myself, my voice sounding strange in the confined space. No wonder Molly had been excited about the thermal imaging. This was unprecedented. I eased the submersible deeper, approaching one of the larger vents. The light it cast was strong enough to illuminate a radius of about 20 meters, revealing rock formations encrusted with mineral deposits. The water near the vent shimmered with heat distortion. My training kicked in. I needed to document everything methodically. I activated the external cameras and began recording, narrating my observations as I maneuvered closer. This is Adam Cortez, Research Station N7. I've discovered what appears to be an extensive geothermal system beneath the Ross Ice Shelf. Multiple vents visible, water temperature anomalously high, no radio contact with base. I circled the largest vent, keeping a safe distance. The submersible's external thermometer showed the water near the vent reaching 4 degrees Celsius. As I panned the cameras across the cavern floor, I noticed something else. The ceiling of the cavern wasn't uniform. There appeared to be a pocket of air above part of the chamber. I guided the submersible upward, moving toward what looked like a water-air interface. The sonar confirmed it. There was indeed a pocket of air above me. My heart raced as I considered the implications. If there was breathable air in this chamber, it would transform our understanding of these under-ice environments. I slowed my ascent as I approached the surface, watching the depth gauge tick down. When the top of the submersible broke through, I used the external cameras to scan the area above water. The ceiling of the cavern arched high overhead, perhaps 50 meters above the water's surface. The orange glow from the vents below reflected off the ice, creating an eerie, sunset-like ambiance. Near one edge of the cavern, I spotted what appeared to be a rocky shoreline. This wasn't just a pocket of air. It was a substantial chamber. I needed to investigate further. I ran the atmospheric analysis program, using the submersible's external sensors to sample the air. After a minute of processing, the results appeared on my screen, and I had to read them twice to believe what I was seeing. Oxygen levels 21%, nitrogen 78%, carbon dioxide 0.4%. I checked the temperature reading. Air temperature, 29 degrees Celsius. That was 85 degrees Fahrenheit, practically tropical conditions hidden beneath the Antarctic ice. I guided the submersible toward the rocky shore, keeping the engines at minimum power to avoid stirring up sediment. As I got closer, the external lights revealed something that made me gasp. Vegetation. Actual plants growing along the edge of the water. I couldn't identify the species from this distance, but they appeared to be ferns and other primitive plants clustered around areas where steam rose from the rocks. This was beyond anything I'd expected to find. It was a self-contained ecosystem, a biological time capsule preserved beneath the ice. I needed to document everything properly. I reached for my tablet and began taking notes, describing what I was seeing in as much detail as possible. I switched the external cameras to high-definition recording mode. making sure to capture footage of the plants from multiple angles. "This is unbelievable," I said as I typed. "Thermal vents creating a microclimate capable of supporting plant life beneath the Antarctic ice shelf. Preliminary visual identification suggests fern species similar to those found in tropical regions. Temperature readings indicate consistent warmth throughout the cavern. This could potentially represent an isolated ecosystem that's been developing independently for thousands, maybe millions of years." I guided the submersible closer to the shore, wanting to get better footage of the plant life. The vegetation became more diverse as I approached. Not just ferns, but what looked like primitive flowering plants as well. This discovery would revolutionize our understanding of Antarctic biology. The implications for research into isolated ecosystems and evolutionary divergence were enormous. As I recorded video and continued making notes, a slight movement in the water caught my attention. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of the submersible's lights, but when I looked up from my tablet, I saw a distinct ripple spreading across the surface behind me. I swiveled in my seat to look through the rear viewport. The water about 20 meters behind the submersible was disturbed, forming a wake that moved directly toward me. Something large was displacing water, something much bigger than any Antarctic marine life I was familiar with. I switched the rear cameras to maximum illumination, trying to penetrate the murky water. For a moment I saw nothing. Then a massive shape moved through the beam of light, a silhouette at least 15 meters long, maybe more. It was too big to be a seal or whale, and the shape was all wrong. It looked almost reptilian, with an elongated body and what appeared to be powerful flippers. My scientific mind struggled to categorize what I was seeing. It couldn't be what it looked like. That was impossible. The creature disappeared from view, and for a few seconds, everything was quiet. I held my breath, scanning the water through all viewports. Nothing. Then, without warning, something slammed into the underside of the submersible with tremendous force. The impact threw me against the control panel, knocking the wind out of me. Warning lights flashed across the console as the submersible rocked violently. "What the?" I didn't have time to finish the thought before another impact hit, this time from the side. The submersible rolled nearly 45 degrees before stabilizing. A hull integrity warning flashed on the main screen, indicating minor damage to the outer shell. I grabbed the controls, trying to move away from whatever was attacking me. The engines responded, but sluggishly. The submersible began to move toward deeper water, away from the shore. Through the starboard viewport, I caught a clear glimpse of my attacker as it circled for another pass. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. A massive reptilian creature with a long, streamlined body, 4 paddle-like limbs, and a jaw filled with conical teeth. It looked like a mosasaur, a marine reptile that had gone extinct with the dinosaurs 66 million years ago. "This is impossible," I whispered, even as the creature banked and charged the submersible again. This time the impact came from behind, sending me lurching forward. My head hit the control panel and I felt warm blood trickling from my forehead. The creature's enormous body scraped along the hull, the sound of scales against metal reverberating through the cabin. More warning lights activated across the console. The propulsion system was damaged, power output dropping to 60%. Worse, a small leak had started somewhere in the rear compartment. I could hear the hiss of water spraying into the cabin. I diverted power to the forward thrusters, trying to put more distance between myself and the creature, but it was too fast. It circled around, its massive body undulating through the water with surprising speed. Through the viewport, I caught another glimpse of it. At least 16 meters long, maybe more, with dark mottled skin that blended with the dim water. The next impact came from directly below, lifting the entire submersible out of the water for a split second before crashing back down. The control panel sparked, and several systems went offline. The leak in the rear compartment worsened, water now pooling around my feet. I fought with the controls, trying to maintain power to the remaining functional systems. The creature circled again, visible through the port viewport, its primitive eye fixing on me with what seemed like deliberate malice. "Come on, come on," I urged the submersible, redirecting power from non-essential systems to propulsion. The engine sputtered, giving me just enough momentum to start moving toward deeper water. The mosasaur, I couldn't think of it as anything else despite the scientific impossibility, made another pass, ramming the starboard side with bone-crushing force. The impact bent the viewport frame, creating another leak as water began spraying through the compromised seal. The submersible was taking on water faster now, and multiple systems were failing. The main power dropped to 30%, the lights flickered, and the navigation system went offline completely. I was fighting a losing battle, trying to keep the vessel operational while evading an extinct predator that shouldn't exist. I yanked the control stick hard to port, fighting the sluggish response as water continued to pool around my ankles. The polar diver wasn't designed for agility even under ideal conditions. Now, with a damaged hull and failing systems, it moved like a wounded animal, but I had no choice. That rocky shoreline was my only chance. "Come on," I muttered, diverting what little power remained to the main thrusters. The shore was maybe 30 meters away, illuminated in that eerie blue-green glow from the thermal vents. Behind me, the massive reptile crashed against the submersible again, sending me lurching forward in my seat. The proximity alarm blared, then cut out completely as another system failed. The main viewport was still intact, giving me a clear view of my destination, a gentle slope of dark volcanic rock extending from the water. I aimed for the shallowest approach I could find and pushed the throttle to maximum. The submersible surged forward, its momentum carrying it toward the shore even as the power indicators dropped to critical levels. I braced myself, gripping the console with white knuckles as the polar diver scraped against the rocky bottom, metal shrieking against stone. The impact slammed me forward against my restraints, knocking the wind from my lungs. For several seconds, I just sat there, catching my breath as the submersible settled. The violent motion had stopped. We'd made it, at least partially, onto the shore. The rear third of the vessel remained in the water, but the forward section was beached on solid ground. I ran a quick systems check, tapping commands into what remained of the functioning console. The damage report confirmed what I already knew. Hull integrity was compromised in 3 sections. Communications were completely dead, and main power was down to 17%. The emergency life support system had automatically activated, giving me air and limited climate control. My research equipment, the external cameras, atmospheric analyzers, and data storage systems were still functioning, running on isolated backup power. Through the viewport, I watched as the massive reptile circled in the shallow water, its scaled hide catching the orange glow from the thermal vents. The creature was massive, 15 meters at least, with a long, powerful tail and jaws that could easily crush the submersible's hull if it got another solid strike. It looked remarkably like a mosasaur, a marine reptile that should have been extinct for 66 million years. As I watched, it lunged partially onto the shore, powerful front flippers dragging its massive body forward as those jaws snapped just meters from the submersible's hull. Then it slipped back into deeper water, circling again, looking for another angle of attack. I unbuckled my restraints and stood carefully, wincing at a sharp pain in my shoulder. The water inside the submersible had stopped rising, settling at about ankle depth in the main compartment. I made my way to the equipment locker, careful not to slip on the wet floor, and pulled out the emergency toolkit. "Okay, Adam," I said aloud, my voice sounding strange in the confined space. "Assess the situation." I was trapped in a cavern hundreds of meters beneath the Antarctic ice shelf. A prehistoric predator was actively hunting me. My submersible was damaged beyond my ability to repair it without external help, and no one knew where I was. I knelt down and opened an access panel to examine the damage to the hull more closely. Water leaked steadily from a rupture in the rear compartment where the creature had struck hardest. Using the flashlight from my kit, I traced the crack. It ran nearly a meter along the seam where two hull plates joined. Even if I had the right materials, this wasn't something I could patch from the inside. Moving to the communications station, I tried the emergency beacon. The system powered up, but the diagnostic screen immediately flashed a warning: no signal transmission. I wasn't surprised. The ice above was too thick, the cavern too deep. The beacon was designed to penetrate water, not hundreds of meters of solid ice. Next, I checked the supply inventory. Standard protocol meant the polar diver carried emergency rations for extended missions, preserved food packs, water purification equipment, and basic survival gear. The digital inventory showed enough food and water for about 2 weeks, assuming careful rationing. I sat back in the pilot's seat and watched the creature make another pass near the shore. 2 weeks. Grant and Molly would have already started searching, of course. The moment I'd been pulled into that underwater tunnel, they would have launched protocols for a missing researcher. But how would they find me? There was no way for them to detect my location beneath hundreds of feet of ice, especially with my beacon unable to transmit. The reality of my situation settled on me with crushing weight. I was on my own. The creature lunged onto shore again, this time making it far enough to bump the rear of the submersible, rocking it slightly before sliding back into the water. I watched it retreat, noting its movement patterns. It seemed to be testing the limits of its mobility on land. Despite my predicament, or perhaps because of it, I found myself slipping into researcher mode. This was, after all, the discovery of a lifetime. A sealed ecosystem beneath the Antarctic ice, complete with what appeared to be living prehistoric marine reptiles. If I was going to be trapped here, I might as well gather as much data as possible. I activated all external cameras and set them to record on a continuous loop. The data storage systems were separate from the main power, with their own backup batteries that could last for days. I adjusted the settings to capture maximum detail while conserving power. The atmospheric analysis from earlier had shown breathable air, which meant I could potentially exit the submersible if necessary. The temperature outside was surprisingly warm, 29 degrees Celsius according to the external sensors, thanks to the thermal vents that dotted the cavern floor. I pulled up the 3D mapping system and began a scan of the visible portions of the cavern. The system created a rough model based on visual data and limited sonar. What emerged was a roughly oval chamber, approximately 300 meters across at its widest point, with the ceiling about 50 meters above the water level. The rocky shoreline extended around perhaps a third of the perimeter, with sheer ice walls making up the rest. My eyes kept returning to the vegetation I'd noticed earlier, primitive-looking ferns and other plants growing near the geothermal vents. If I could reach them, they might provide valuable samples. But with the mosasaur patrolling the water's edge, any excursion would be extremely risky. I began making notes on my tablet, documenting everything I could observe from the relative safety of the beached submersible. The scientific value of this discovery was incalculable. An isolated ecosystem that had apparently been sealed off from the rest of the world for millions of years. If I ever made it back, this data would revolutionize our understanding of evolution and adaptation. But that was a big if. As I worked, I found myself formulating potential escape strategies. The submersible wasn't going anywhere. The damage was too severe, and even if I could repair it, the creature would attack the moment I returned to open water. The tunnel I'd been pulled through was the only known way in or out of the cavern, and it was underwater, guarded by a prehistoric predator. I considered the ice walls. If I could somehow climb them, perhaps I could find a fissure or crack leading upward, maybe eventually to the surface. But that would require climbing equipment I didn't have, and the ice looked smooth and treacherous. The thermal vents offered another possibility. If they were part of a larger geothermal system, they might connect to other caverns or channels. But exploring them would mean getting past the mosasaur and potentially exposing myself to toxic gases or extreme temperatures. For now, my safest option was to remain in the submersible, continue gathering data, and wait for the creature to lose interest, if it ever did. I had supplies for 2 weeks. In that time, perhaps I could devise a better plan, or maybe Grant and the others would somehow locate me, though I couldn't imagine how. I watched the mosasaur make another circuit of the shallow water. It seemed tireless, patient, as if it had all the time in the world. And perhaps it did, but I didn't. I turned back to my instruments and continued documenting the impossible world around me, recording everything I could while simultaneously working on plans for escape. Whatever happened, I was determined that this discovery, and hopefully I myself, would somehow make it back to the world above. I spent the next several hours watching the mosasaur through the viewport. The massive creature patrolled back and forth in the water, its long body undulating with surprising grace despite its size. Every 15 minutes or so, it would approach the submersible, circle it once, and then return to its regular swimming pattern. The behavior seemed deliberate, almost ritualistic, like it was checking to make sure I hadn't moved. The pooled water inside the polar diver had stopped rising, settling at just above ankle level. I'd managed to seal off the worst of the leaks with emergency hull patches from the repair kit, but the submersible was clearly beyond any hope of becoming waterworthy again. The cracked viewport, damaged thrusters, and compromised hull integrity meant this vessel had made its final journey. I pulled up the main console's display and activated all external cameras. The rear cameras still worked despite the damage to that section, giving me a 360-degree view of my surroundings. The cavern was even more remarkable when viewed in full. Geothermal vents dotted the landscape both in and out of the water, creating pockets of steam where they breached the surface. The primitive vegetation I'd noticed earlier grew in concentrated circles around these heat sources, mostly ferns and moss-like plants that had no business existing in Antarctica. Isolated evolution, I muttered to myself, my scientific mind taking over despite my predicament. I tapped commands into the console to begin recording time-lapse footage from all cameras. If nothing else, I needed to document everything about this place. My attention returned to the mosasaur as it completed another circuit of the water. This time, I noticed something odd about its swimming pattern. After passing the submersible, it didn't continue in a random patrol, but headed directly toward a particular area near the far wall of the cavern. The creature slowed as it approached a large thermal vent about 80 meters from my position, where the water bubbled and steamed. I switched to camera 3 and adjusted the view to focus on that area. The steam obscured much of what was happening, but I could make out the creature lingering there for several minutes before resuming its patrol. When it left, I kept the camera trained on the spot, curious about what drew it back repeatedly. On its next visit to the same location, I activated the zoom function on the external camera. The image quality degraded slightly, but remained clear enough to reveal what had been hidden by distance and steam. There, partially buried in the warm sand near the vent, lay several large, oblong objects. "Eggs," I whispered, leaning forward. "They're eggs." The realization hit me with the force of scientific discovery. This wasn't just any mosasaur, it was a female protecting her clutch. The aggressive behavior, the territorial patrols, the repeated checks on the potential threat, my submersible, it all made perfect sense now. She wasn't hunting me out of malice, she was defending her offspring. I counted at least 6 eggs visible in the sand, each roughly the size of a football. They were partially buried, presumably to keep them at an optimal temperature using the heat from the nearby vent. The mother returned to them regularly, nudging the sand with her snout, perhaps turning them or checking their condition. This changed everything about my understanding of the situation. I wasn't dealing with a mindless predator, but a mother with a powerful biological imperative to protect her young. Her earlier attacks on the submersible weren't random aggression. They were the actions of a threatened parent. I pulled up the mapping program on the main console. Over the past few hours, the submersible's passive sensors had been collecting data about the cavern. I instructed the computer to compile this information into a 3-dimensional model. The program worked for several minutes, integrating sonar readings, temperature data, and visual input from the cameras. The resulting map confirmed my earlier estimates, but provided much more detail. The cavern stretched approximately 320 meters at its widest point and was roughly oval in shape. The ceiling peaked at about 53 meters above the water's surface. Most importantly, the sensors had mapped the ice thickness above us. Varying between 35 and 42 meters of solid ice separated this hidden world from the Antarctic surface. I opened a new file in my research journal and began documenting my findings. Day 1, beneath Ross Ice Shelf, isolated cavern ecosystem. Temperature inside cavern, 29 degrees. Water temperature, variable, 1 to 4 degrees near vents. Atmospheric composition, normal and breathable. Cavern dimensions, approx. 320 megs, 240, ceiling height 53, ice thickness above 35.42 milliliters. Primary observation: living specimen of what appears to be Mosasaurus or related marine reptile, approx. Crist in length. Female specimen with clutch of eggs, 6+ visible, near thermal vent. Behavior indicates standard reptilian maternal protection patterns. This ecosystem appears completely isolated from the outside world, sustained by geothermal activity that creates a localized temperate environment. The presence of primitive plant life suggests a complete, self-contained ecosystem that must have existed for millennia, possibly dating back to the Cretaceous period. I paused in my typing, struck by the implications. This wasn't just a random anomaly, it was a living time capsule. Somehow, when the rest of the dinosaurs and marine reptiles died out 65 million years ago, this pocket of life had continued, sheltered by the ice and warmed by the Earth's heat. How many generations of mosasaurs had lived and died in this hidden world? The thought was staggering. This could be the most significant zoological discovery of the century, perhaps of all time. A living fossil and her offspring, existing in a place where they should have been impossible. The mother mosasaur completed another circuit, passing close to the submersible. This time I didn't flinch. I watched her with new appreciation, understanding the purpose behind her movements. Her dark eyes seemed to track me through the viewport as she passed, and I wondered how many humans, if any, she had seen before. I continued my notes, adding sketches and references to the video footage timestamps. The scientific importance of this discovery couldn't be overstated. It would rewrite textbooks, challenge our understanding of extinction events, and open up new fields of study in evolutionary biology and adaptation. But all of that hinged on one critical factor. I needed to find a way out of here alive. I closed my journal file and pulled up the submersible's inventory system. If I was going to escape this cavern and avoid becoming a permanent part of this isolated ecosystem, I needed to take stock of every piece of equipment at my disposal. The polar diver had been outfitted for research, not for cave exploration or ice drilling. Still, I had emergency gear, sample collection tools, basic climbing equipment for shore excursions, and the submersible's components themselves, some of which might be repurposed. I began methodically reviewing each category of equipment, making notes about potential uses. The portable core sampler might be modified into a rudimentary ice drill. The emergency flares could potentially be used to melt ice in a controlled manner. The submersible's battery power, while limited, might be channeled into heating elements. As I worked through the inventory, I kept one eye on the mother mosasaur. She had returned to her nest and seemed to be settling in for a longer stay, her massive body partially out of the water as she guarded her eggs. Her presence was both magnificent and terrifying, a reminder of what I stood to lose if I failed, both personally and scientifically. I needed a plan that would get me out without disturbing her territory more than necessary. The last thing I wanted was to provoke her into another attack. Whatever escape route I devised would need to be as far from her nest as possible. I turned my attention back to the equipment list, searching for anything that might help create an exit, while keeping a safe distance from the increasingly territorial mosasaur mother. I turned my attention to the cavern ceiling, adjusting the external cameras of the polar diver to map what lay above me. After spending hours watching the mosasaur, I needed a concrete escape plan. The ankle-deep water sloshed around my boots as I shifted in my seat, my shoulder still aching from the impact when we'd beached. The main console displayed feeds from all 4 external cameras. I linked them to the mapping program, which would compile the visual data into a 3-dimensional model. Camera 2 had the best upward angle, so I focused it on the ice ceiling and began a systematic scan. "Start with quadrants," I muttered to myself, dividing the ceiling into sections on the display. Northwest to southeast, 5-meter increments. The mapping program highlighted variations in the ice as I scanned. Most areas showed thickness between 35 and 42 meters, consistent with my earlier readings, too thick to penetrate with anything I had on board. I continued the methodical sweep, marking each section on the digital map as I completed it. In the northeast quadrant, something caught my eye. The ice structure looked different, less dense, with subtle variations in color that the cameras picked up. I adjusted camera 2 for maximum zoom and enhanced the image. "That can't be right," I said, leaning closer to the screen. The program estimated the ice thickness at just 6 meters, about 20 feet, compared to the 100+ feet everywhere else. I ran the calculation twice more to confirm. The results were consistent. This section was dramatically thinner than the surrounding ice. I sat back, considering what this meant. The thermal activity in the cavern must have been melting the ice from below for centuries, perhaps millennia. But this particular section had thinned much more than its surroundings. Maybe water currents directed the warmth to this spot, or perhaps the ice composition was different there. I switched to the thermal imaging overlay. Sure enough, there was slightly elevated temperature in that section of ceiling. Not dramatic, but enough to confirm my theory. The ice was melting from below, and for whatever reason, this patch had thinned considerably more than the rest. My pulse quickened. 6 meters of ice was still formidable, but potentially within reach. With the right approach, I might be able to create an opening to the surface. The mosasaur circled into view on camera 3, reminding me of the danger lurking just meters away. She swam a lazy loop near her nest before disappearing again from the frame. Her pattern hadn't changed, but her circles seemed to be drawing closer to the submersible. I needed to work quickly. I pulled up the equipment inventory on the console. Standard gear for a research submersible included sample collection tools, but the polar diver had been outfitted with something special for this expedition. an experimental ice coring drill. The drill had been installed to extract cylindrical ice samples from the shelf for climate research. It was designed to bore clean, precise cores about 15 centimeters in diameter and up to 10 meters deep. Not intended for creating escape hatches, but it might be the only option I had. I opened the technical specifications and studied them carefully. The drill was mounted on a retractable arm on the submersible's dorsal section. It used a heated carbide bit and was powered by the submersible's main battery. Under normal operations, it would take core samples without compromising the vessel's power reserves. But normal operations weren't what I needed now. I walked to the rear of the cabin, wincing as the motion sent a jolt of pain through my injured shoulder. A small access panel revealed the drill's control module, separate from the main console for safety reasons. The module displayed current settings: maximum depth of 10 meters, diameter 15 centimeters, power consumption limited to 8% of available reserves. "Not going to cut it," I said, examining the override controls. The drill had safety limiters that prevented overheating and power drainage. Those limiters were there for good reasons, but right now, they stood between me and potential freedom. I needed to push this equipment far beyond what its designers had intended. I returned to the pilot's seat and began running calculations. The drill would need to operate continuously for hours to create a hole large enough for me to climb through. Even if I removed all safety protocols, the power drain would be massive. I had 17% power remaining in the main batteries, barely enough for life support for my 2-week supply window. On the console, I created a new simulation. If I diverted all power except critical life support to the drill, I could potentially create an opening about 60 centimeters wide, just enough to squeeze through with minimal gear. But the process would drain the batteries completely, leaving me with no backup if the plan failed. Movement on camera 4 caught my attention. The mosasaur was approaching again, but this time she didn't follow her usual pattern. She swam directly toward the submersible, her massive body cutting through the water with purpose. "No, no, no," I whispered, tracking her approach. She lunged partially onto the rocky shore, her jaws snapping at the air less than 2 meters from the submersible's hull. This was more aggressive than her previous behavior. She was testing the limits, seeing how far she could reach. I held my breath as she thrashed, her body weight shifting the rocks beneath her. Then she slid back into the water, circling once more before returning to deeper water. The encounter left me shaken. Her behavior was escalating just as I'd feared. Maternal protection instincts were powerful motivators, and she clearly saw the submersible as a potential threat to her eggs. I checked camera 3, which showed her nest. The eggs looked unchanged, partially buried in the warm sand near the thermal vent. But the mother was growing bolder, more determined. It was only a matter of time before she found a way to reach the submersible, or before the next lunge pushed us back into the water where we'd be completely vulnerable. With renewed urgency, I returned to the drill control module and began reprogramming its settings. The interface protested with warning messages as I bypassed safety protocols one by one. Maximum depth. Exceeded override. YNI selected Y. Power consumption. Exceeds safe parameters override. YN. Again, Y. Continuous operation beyond rated capacity will cause permanent damage. Proceed. YN. I hesitated only briefly before selecting Y. The module recalibrated, accepting my new parameters. I was pushing the equipment to its breaking point, but I had no choice. According to my calculations, the drill would operate at nearly 3 times its designed capacity. It would almost certainly burn out before completing the job, but if it created enough of an opening, I might be able to finish the work manually with the climbing tools. I was about to activate the drill when the entire submersible shuddered violently. I grabbed the console to steady myself as water sloshed around my feet. Camera 4 showed the mosasaur had returned, more aggressive than ever. She had lunged further onto shore, her massive body slamming against the submersible's aft section. The impact shifted the polar diver, pushing it back several centimeters toward the water. I checked the positioning. The submersible had slid back about 30 centimeters, leaving less of it beached on the rocky shore. Another few hits like that, and we'd be back in the water, where the mosasaur would have full access to the hull. My heart raced as I watched her retreat into the water, circling for another approach. The timer I'd set based on her pattern indicated she'd likely return in about 12 minutes. 12 minutes until the next attack. I worked frantically, finalizing the drill modifications. The targeting system needed precise coordinates to hit the thinnest section of ice. I transferred the mapping data, marking the exact spot where the 6-meter thickness had been detected. On the console, I calculated power requirements, structural stress factors, and estimated time to completion. Under ideal conditions, the drill might create a usable opening in about 6 hours, but conditions were far from ideal. Between power limitations and the increasing mosasaur threat, I'd be lucky to get half that time. I constantly checked the cameras, keeping track of the mosasaur's position. She was still circling, but her movements seemed more purposeful now, less patrol and more hunting behavior. Time was running out. Either the mosasaur would eventually succeed in pushing the submersible back into the water, or my supplies would dwindle to nothing. The modified drill represented my only chance at escape, a desperate plan with slim odds of success. I hovered my finger over the activation control, watching the mosasaur through the camera feed. She was turning, beginning her approach for another attack. I had perhaps 30 seconds before impact. The drill was ready. My calculations were as good as they could be given the circumstances. Now I just needed to start the process before the next impact potentially pushed us back into the water. My finger pressed the button as I watched the massive prehistoric predator accelerate toward the submersible. The submersible lurched violently as the mosasaur slammed into its rear section, her massive body driving the polar diver further into the water. My hands flew to the console to steady myself as I watched the shoreline recede through the viewport. The drill had barely started its activation sequence, its mechanical whine competing with the screech of metal as the vessel scraped over the rocky bottom. "No, no, no," I muttered, watching the water level outside rise past the lower half of the viewport. The mosasaur circled away, her massive tail propelling her through the water with surprising grace for something so large. I knew she'd be back. Her attacks were becoming more coordinated, more purposeful, as if she'd figured out that pushing the submersible back into the water gave her the advantage. I checked the external camera feeds. The submersible was now floating freely in the lagoon, no longer beached on the rocky shore. My temporary sanctuary was gone. The water inside the cabin sloshed around my ankles, a constant reminder of the vessel's compromised hull integrity. Another impact rocked the polar diver, this one from below. Warning lights flashed across the console as systems struggled to compensate. The main power indicator flickered from 17% down to 15%. Each attack was costing precious energy I couldn't afford to lose. "Come on," I said through gritted teeth, working the controls to position the submersible directly beneath the thin ice section I'd identified earlier. The navigation display showed my current position nearly 30 meters away from the target zone. I engaged the lateral thrusters, wincing as they whined in protest. The submersible responded sluggishly, moving at perhaps a quarter of its normal speed. The mosasaur appeared on camera 3, circling below me before ascending rapidly. I braced for impact. The hit came from the port side this time, sending me sprawling against my restraints. Pain shot through my injured shoulder. The polar diver spun in a lazy half-circle, thrusters struggling to stabilize against the current created by the creature's movement. "She's learning," I said to myself, massaging my shoulder. "She's figuring out how to herd me away from the thin spot." I reached for the restraint straps, pulling them tighter across my chest and waist. If I was going to position this vessel correctly, I needed to be secured. The next few minutes would be a battle of wills between me and the ancient predator. I diverted additional power to the thrusters, watching the main battery indicator drop to 14%. The thin ice section appeared on camera too, roughly 20 meters ahead now. The submersible crawled forward, fighting against currents and the damage to its propulsion systems. The mosasaur appeared again, this time positioning herself directly between the submersible and my target zone. Her massive jaws opened and closed in what I could only interpret as a warning display. I adjusted course slightly, trying to maneuver around her, but she matched my movements with uncanny precision. "She knows," I whispered. "Somehow she knows what I'm trying to do." I pulled up the drill diagnostics on the secondary display. The modifications I'd made had bypassed multiple safety protocols, pushing the system far beyond its designed parameters. The power consumption estimates were higher than I'd initially calculated. At current levels, the drill would drain the remaining battery in less than 4 hours, not the 6 I'd estimated. That might not be enough time to create an opening large enough to escape through. Another hit, this one glancing off the starboard bow. The submersible yawed right, and I corrected with the thrusters. 15 meters to target now. The mosasaur circled and came back for another pass, her massive body visible through all external cameras as she circled the vessel. I needed a strategy. Direct confrontation wasn't working. I killed the forward thrusters and let the submersible drift, watching the mosasaur's reaction. She slowed her circling, seemingly confused by my change in tactics. I waited, letting her settle into a new patrol pattern before engaging the thrusters again at minimal power. This time, I kept the vessel's movement subtle, almost imperceptible. The mosasaur continued her patrol, paying less attention as the submersible crept toward the target zone. 10 meters. 8. 5. I held my breath as the mapping overlay indicated I was now positioned directly beneath the thinnest section of ice. I cut the thrusters entirely, letting the submersible hang motionless in the water. The mosasaur continued her circuit of the lagoon, seemingly satisfied that I'd stopped trying to reach this area. With the vessel in position, I turned my attention to final preparations. The drill would create a hole, but what then? Breaking through to the surface meant exposing this entire cavern to the freezing Antarctic waters above. The temperature differential would create a powerful current as the warmer water rushed upward, potentially turning the entire cavern into a swirling death trap. I accessed the emergency compartment inventory from the console and began selecting survival gear. The thermal diving suit was designed for brief excursions in near-freezing water, not extended exposure, but it was better than nothing. The emergency air supply would give me approximately 20 minutes of breathing time, hopefully enough to make it through the ice tunnel and reach the surface. I carefully organized the gear, placing it within arm's reach of the pilot's seat. The climbing equipment would be essential: ice picks, crampons, and a length of carbon fiber rope. I'd need to ascend through the drill hole quickly before the rushing water made it impossible. The diagnostics I ran on the modified drill showed critical strain on multiple systems. The power coupling was operating at nearly 3 times its rated capacity. The drill motor was showing early signs of bearing failure. The cutting head's rotation speed was fluctuating outside acceptable parameters. It only needs to work once, I told myself, finalizing the targeting sequence. The drill arm extended from its housing on top of the submersible, positioning itself against the ceiling of ice. The cutting head began to spin, slowly at first, then building to a high-pitched whine that reverberated through the cabin. The mosasaur's reaction was immediate. Her head snapped toward the submersible, massive body twisting in the water as she changed direction. She didn't like the sound, or perhaps she sensed the vibrations in the water. Either way, she was coming back, and fast. I locked the drill controls, ensuring it would continue operating even if the console was damaged. The first few centimeters of ice gave way easily, the cutting head disappearing into the ceiling. A shower of ice particles rained down onto the submersible's hull. The main power indicator dropped to 12%. The drill was consuming energy faster than I'd anticipated. At this rate, I had maybe 3 hours before complete power failure, not enough time to create an adequate escape route. I adjusted the power settings again, pushing them even higher. Warning messages flashed across the screen, but I dismissed them. The cutting speed increased marginally, the drill now boring through approximately 10 centimeters of ice per minute. Still too slow, but better. The mosasaur disappeared from all camera feeds. I scanned each one in quick succession, trying to locate her. Nothing. The absence of the massive predator was somehow more terrifying than seeing her approach. "Where are you?" I murmured, switching between cameras. The water around the submersible was clear in all directions. Had she retreated to her nest? Was she circling below, out of camera range? The not knowing was nerve-wracking. I used the moment of reprieve to check the drill's progress. Nearly 60 centimeters of penetration achieved. Only 5.5 meters to go. The power level had dropped to 11%. It was going to be close. I began pulling on the thermal diving suit, awkwardly maneuvering in the confined space of the pilot's seat. My injured shoulder protested as I worked my arm into the sleeve. The suit's material was stiff and unyielding, designed to trap body heat while keeping the freezing water at bay. I left the hood and gloves off for now, needing to maintain dexterity at the controls. The drill continued to whine overhead, its pitch occasionally fluctuating as it encountered denser patches of ice. I watched the depth indicator slowly tick upward, 70 centimeters, 80, 90. Still no sign of the mosasaur. The absence stretched from seconds to minutes. 5 minutes now with no visual contact. This wasn't normal behavior based on what I'd observed. She'd never left the submersible unattended this long. I adjusted camera 4 to scan the area near her nest. The eggs were visible, partially buried in the sand near the thermal vent, but the mother was nowhere to be seen. A chill ran up my spine despite the warmth of the diving suit. Something had changed. The drill depth reached 120 centimeters. Power levels at 10%. The cutting head was beginning to show signs of wear, its efficiency dropping by small but measurable increments. I calculated that at current rates the power would fail, just as the drill broke through the ice ceiling, assuming the cutting head didn't fail first. I reached for the emergency air tank, checking its pressure gauge and regulator. Full capacity as expected. I positioned it where I could grab it quickly when the moment came. The ice picks and crampons went into a small pack that I could sling over my good shoulder. A shadow passed across camera 2. I froze, hand hovering over the console. The shadow moved again, larger this time but still indistinct. Not the mosasaur. The shape was wrong, too amorphous. I switched to thermal imaging on camera 2, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The water temperature around the submersible was dropping rapidly. Plumes of colder water were seeping in from somewhere, creating swirling patterns of blue and purple on the thermal overlay. The drill, I realized aloud. It's already breaching into the seawater above. The implications hit me all at once. The ice wasn't a uniform 6 meters thick. There must be fissures, channels where the seawater above was already finding its way through. The drill hadn't fully penetrated yet, but it had weakened the barrier enough for water to begin seeping through. I needed to act now. The drill depth was only at 150 centimeters, not even close to creating a passage large enough for me to escape through. But if I waited until the drill completed its work, the temperature differential might trigger a catastrophic collapse. I aligned the submersible directly beneath the drill site, using the thrusters to maintain position with millimeter precision. The seepage was increasing, visible now even without thermal imaging as tendrils of darker, colder water swirled down from above. The cabin temperature began to drop as the frigid water affected the environment around the submersible. I pulled on the diving hood and gloves, completing the thermal protection. The suit immediately began to heat in response to the colder external temperature. Where was the mosasaur? Her absence now seemed ominous rather than fortunate. Had she sensed the changing conditions? Was she retreating to protect her eggs? I made one final check of my equipment. The air tank was secure, the climbing gear was ready, the emergency beacon was activated, though I had no idea if its signal could penetrate the ice above. I took a deep breath, steadying myself for what came next. The drill suddenly screeched, its pitch changing to something high and tortured. The depth indicator showed 210 centimeters, but the cutting speed had dropped dramatically. The power level was at 8% and falling quickly. A new alarm sounded. Water temperature at the drill site had dropped below 0 degrees Celsius. Ice was beginning to form around the drill shaft, threatening to seize the mechanism completely. I needed to reposition. If the drill froze in place, I'd lose my chance at the thinnest section of ice. I engaged the thrusters, trying to angle the submersible to maintain contact between the drill and the ice ceiling, while preventing it from freezing in place. Movement on camera 3 caught my eye. Something massive was rising from the depths of the lagoon. The mosasaur had returned, and she was coming straight up from below, her powerful tail propelling her with frightening speed. Her jaws were open wide, revealing rows of conical teeth designed for grasping prey. My hand hovered over the drill controls. Should I abort? Try to evade? The decision was made for me as the drill suddenly broke through another fissure in the ice, sending a powerful jet of freezing water into the cavern. The submersible shuddered under the impact, and warning lights cascaded across the console. The mosasaur continued her ascent, jaws open wide for what appeared to be a decisive attack. I braced myself, hands gripping the console as the massive predator rocketed toward the submersible. I pressed the activation button for the drill just as a tremendous jolt rocked the submersible. The mosasaur's massive jaws clamped onto the rear section of the polar diver with enough force to bend metal. My body lurched forward against the restraints, sending a sharp pain through my injured shoulder. "Come on, work," I said, watching the drill's startup sequence initiate on the console. The mechanical whine filled the cabin as the drill arm extended upward toward the ice ceiling. I'd pushed it well beyond its design specifications, and the sound it made, a high-pitched grinding that occasionally stuttered, told me it wasn't happy about it. The console lit up with red warning notifications. Power consumption rates exceeded predictions, dropping from 17% to 15% in the first 30 seconds. At this rate, I'd lose all power before breaking through. The mosasaur shook the submersible like a dog with a toy. Metal groaned under the stress. Through camera 3, I saw her massive jaw muscles flex as she bit down harder, puncturing through the already damaged hull section. More water began pouring in, rising past my ankles. "Just hold together a little longer," I muttered to the submersible, as if it could hear me. I checked the drill's progress. The depth indicator showed it had penetrated only 40 centimeters into the ice. Not nearly enough. The drill needed to bore through at least 5 more meters before breaking through. Another violent shake sent tools and equipment flying across the cabin. The main console flickered, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I'd lose everything. When it stabilized, the power reading showed 12% remaining, On camera 1, I noticed something unexpected. Small fractures were spreading from the drill site across the cavern ceiling. The vibrations from the drill combined with the heat it generated were weakening the ice structure faster than I'd calculated. The thin section wasn't just thin, it was unstable. The mosasaur released her grip momentarily, circling around for another attack. I had maybe 10 seconds before she struck again. I unbuckled my restraints and grabbed the emergency survival kit I'd prepared. The water level inside the cabin had risen to mid-calf, frigid despite the submersible's heating systems trying to compensate. I looked up at the ceiling monitor. The fractures were spreading faster now, spiderwebbing outward from the drill site in all directions. The depth indicator showed 120 centimeters. Still not enough for escape, but the structural integrity of the entire ceiling was compromised. The mosasaur appeared on camera 3, circling back. This time she approached from below, her massive body coiling for a powerful upward strike. I stumbled toward the emergency compartment at the center of the submersible, designed as a last resort survival capsule. It had its own power supply, reinforced walls, and limited life support. I threw the survival kit inside just as the mosasaur slammed into the underside of the polar diver with such force that I was lifted off my feet. I fell hard onto the metal floor, now covered in several inches of water. The main console sparked as seawater reached exposed wiring. Power dropped to 8%. The drill continued its work, now showing 200 centimeters of penetration. But that wasn't what caught my attention. The fractures had spread across nearly a third of the cavern ceiling, and small chunks of ice were breaking free, splashing into the water below. Warning alarms blared throughout the submersible. The hull integrity monitor showed critical breaches in multiple sections. The cabin temperature dropped rapidly as more frigid water poured in. I dragged myself into the emergency compartment, fighting against the rising water in my throbbing shoulder. Once inside, I hit the seal button. Reinforced doors slid closed with a pneumatic hiss, cutting off the alarms from the main cabin. Through the small viewport in the compartment door, I could still see the main console, now partially submerged in water. I activated the compartment's survival heaters, which kicked on with a low hum. The small space began to warm immediately. The emergency compartment had its own monitoring system, a simplified version of the main console, which I activated next. It displayed feeds from the external cameras and basic system status. On the monitor, I watched as the fractures across the ice ceiling suddenly accelerated. What had been a slow spread became a catastrophic failure in seconds. A massive crack split the ceiling from one side of the cavern to the other. The drill, still boring steadily upward, finally broke through the remaining ice barrier. But it wasn't a controlled opening as I'd planned. The entire section of weakened ice gave way at once. Millions of gallons of sub-zero Antarctic seawater crashed into the cavern in a violent deluge. The temperature monitor showed an immediate plummet as the warm ecosystem collided with the freezing ocean above. Massive ice blocks followed the water, some the size of cars, plummeting into the cavern. Through camera 4, I spotted the mosasaur. She'd been near the surface when the ceiling collapsed, and the sudden influx of freezing water hit her directly. Her body contorted in violent spasms, muscles seizing from the thermal shock. She was an animal evolved for this isolated warm water environment. Her body couldn't handle the sudden temperature change. She thrashed wildly, trying to swim away from the cold, but the freezing water surrounded her completely. Within seconds, her movement slowed. Her massive body drifted lifelessly as the temperature continued to drop. The monitor showed the water temperature now at minus 1.8 degrees Celsius, normal for Antarctic waters, but lethal for the creatures of this warm cavern. The submersible rocked violently as currents from the collapsing ceiling pushed it around. I braced myself against the walls of the emergency compartment, watching the disaster unfold on the monitors. The primitive plants near the thermal vents were uprooted and swept away by the currents. Smaller creatures I hadn't even noticed before floated dead in the rapidly cooling water. An entire ecosystem that had survived in isolation for millennia was being destroyed before my eyes. The water level in the cavern rose quickly as the ocean poured in. The polar diver, despite its damaged state, was buoyant enough to rise with it. I felt the familiar sensation of ascending as the submersible was lifted toward the ceiling. More ice blocks crashed down, one striking near the submersible with enough force to send it spinning. I grabbed the handrails inside the emergency compartment to steady myself. The external camera feeds cut out one by one as their connections failed, leaving only camera 2 operational. Through this last working camera, I watched as the submersible pressed against the newly formed hole in the ice ceiling. The emergency beacon, which had been useless under 30 meters of solid ice, was now potentially unobstructed. If it could transmit through the remaining ice and water above, someone might pick up the signal. The temperature inside the emergency compartment began to drop despite the heaters working at full capacity. The walls of the compartment, designed to withstand pressure but not extreme cold, couldn't fully insulate against the freezing temperatures outside. The main systems of the polar diver failed one by one. The last power reading I saw on the monitor showed 2% before it flickered and went dark. Only the emergency systems of my small compartment remained functional. I reached for the beacon control, part of the emergency system with its own power supply. I pressed the activation button and a small green light confirmed it was transmitting. Whether anyone would receive it remained unknown. The last camera feed died, leaving me in near darkness except for the dim emergency lights of the compartment. I pulled thermal blankets from the survival kit and wrapped them around myself, trying to conserve body heat as the temperature continued to drop. Ice began forming on the inside of the viewport, spreading in crystalline patterns across the glass. I retreated to the back of the compartment where the heaters were mounted, huddling against them for warmth. The sounds of the cavern's destruction faded as the submersible rose higher, eventually replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of metal contracting in the cold. The heaters cycled on and off, fighting a losing battle against the Antarctic temperatures surrounding the compartment. I checked the beacon again, confirming it was still active. The small green light blinked steadily, sending out its electronic plea for rescue. I pulled the thermal blankets tighter around me, my breath visible in the cold air of the compartment. My fate now depended entirely on someone receiving that distress signal. 3 days passed in a hazy blur of consciousness and darkness. I drifted in and out of awareness, my body trembling despite the thermal blankets wrapped tightly around me. The emergency compartment's heaters fought a losing battle against the Antarctic cold that seeped through every seam of the polar diver. I rationed the emergency supplies, taking small sips of water and bites of high-calorie bars when I was lucid enough to remember. My injured shoulder had stiffened completely, and I could barely move my arm without waves of pain radiating through my torso. I was dozing fitfully when I heard it, a mechanical grinding sound from above the submersible. At first, I thought it was just another hallucination brought on by cold and exhaustion. I'd been hearing phantom noises for hours, the mosasaur's attacks, the cracking ice, the alarms that had long since died with the power systems. But this sound persisted, growing louder and more rhythmic. Drilling. I pushed myself up from the floor where I'd been huddled near the last functioning heater. The movement sent a fresh jolt of pain through my shoulder, but I ignored it. I pressed my ear against the ceiling of the emergency compartment, holding my breath to listen more carefully. The drilling stopped for a moment, and then I heard something else. Voices, muffled, distant, but unmistakably human. I wasn't imagining it. "Hello," I called out. my voice cracking from disuse and dehydration. I pounded on the ceiling with my good arm. "I'm down here!" The drilling resumed, louder now, and I crawled to the small viewport that had been completely frosted over with ice. I wiped at it with my sleeve, clearing a small circle through which I could peer. Outside was mostly darkness, but occasionally a beam of light would sweep past, illuminating swirling ice particles in the water. I pressed the emergency beacon's activation button again, confirming it was still transmitting. The small green light blinked steadily, the only functioning electronic device left in my frozen sanctuary. The drilling stopped again, and this time, the voices were clearer. Signals strongest right here. We're directly above it. I recognized that voice immediately. Grant. My brother was up there. I pounded on the ceiling again. "Grant, I'm here. I'm alive." More drilling, more voices, and then a loud mechanical whine that vibrated through the entire compartment. I returned to the viewport and wiped away the fresh frost. Through the small clearing, I saw a large mechanical claw descend through the water, illuminated by powerful spotlights from above. The claw opened, positioned itself around what must have been part of the polar diver, and closed. The submersible shifted, and I braced myself against the wall as I felt an upward pull. The movement was slow, deliberate, as the rescue team carefully extracted the vessel from its icy prison. I watched through the frosted viewport as we ascended through the water, past broken sheets of ice, toward a growing circle of light above. When the submersible breached the surface, the change in pressure made my ears pop painfully. I heard the sound of heavy machinery, shouts, and the howling Antarctic wind. The vessel swayed as it was lifted completely out of the water and settled onto what I assumed was solid ice. I heard metallic clanking against the hull, and then footsteps moving across the top of the submersible. Someone was trying to access the external hatch controls. I crawled to the emergency compartment's door, but it was frozen shut from the inside, ice having formed around the seals. "The hatch is jammed," a voice called out, Molly Elliott's unmistakable commanding tone. "Get the thermal lance." I pressed my face against the small viewport in the emergency compartment door, trying to see into the main cabin of the submersible. It was dark except for beams of light now streaming in through the main viewport, which was still remarkably intact despite everything the vessel had endured. A loud hissing sound came from above, followed by the smell of burning metal. They were cutting through. I retreated to the far wall of the compartment, covering my face as sparks began to fall from the ceiling hatch. The cutting continued for what felt like an eternity, and then stopped. There was a moment of silence before a loud bang as something heavy struck the hatch. Once, twice, and on the third impact, the hatch gave way, falling inward and clattering to the floor of the main cabin. Cold air rushed in, somehow even colder than what I'd been enduring, carrying with it swirling snow and the smell of diesel engines. A powerful beam of light shone down through the opening, momentarily blinding me. "Adam? Adam Cortez." Grant's voice echoed through the submersible. "Emergency compartment," I called back, my voice weak. "I'm in here." I heard rapid footsteps across the frozen metal floor of the main cabin, and then a face appeared at the viewport of the emergency compartment. Grant, wearing a heavy Arctic expedition suit, his face partially obscured by a frost-covered mask and goggles. "He's in here," Grant shouted over his shoulder. "Get the thermal lance again." Grant's eyes met mine through the viewport. "Hang on, Adam. We're getting you out." The hissing sound of the thermal lance resumed, this time directed at the door of the emergency compartment. I shielded my face from the sparks, retreating to the corner. When the cutting stopped, I heard Grant and another rescuer counting down before ramming something against the door. It took 4 attempts before the frozen seals gave way and the door swung open. Cold air and light flooded in. Grant was the first through the doorway, rushing to my side and kneeling beside me. "Jesus, Adam," he said, pulling off his goggles to get a better look at me. "Can you move?" I nodded weakly. "Shoulder's bad. Everything else works." Grant helped me to my feet, while another rescuer, I didn't recognize him, gathered the emergency kit and my research equipment. My legs nearly buckled as I stood, and Grant had to support most of my weight as we moved toward the exit. "Molly's got a medical team standing by," Grant said as we navigated through the frozen, waterlogged main cabin. "The polar diver's a total loss, but you're not, and that's what matters." We reached the base of the ladder leading to the hatch. Looking up, I saw daylight, actual daylight, for the first time in days. Grant helped position me below the opening. "Can you climb?" he asked. I tested my good arm by gripping one of the ladder rungs. "No," I admitted. "Not on my own." Grant nodded and called up to the team above. A moment later, a rescue harness was lowered through the hatch. With Grant's help, I managed to get it around my torso, wincing as it pressed against my injured shoulder. "Ready to go up?" Grant asked. I looked around the submersible one last time, the vessel that had been both my prison and my salvation. The console was dark, covered in ice, all systems dead. Water had frozen in rippled patterns across the floor. The viewport showed only white ice and blue sky beyond. "I'm ready," I said. Grant signaled to the team above, and I felt the harness tighten as they began to hoist me up. The ascent was slow and painful, my body bumping occasionally against the sides of the hatch opening. As my head cleared the hatch, the full force of Antarctica hit me, blinding sunlight reflecting off endless white, wind cutting through my thermal gear like it wasn't even there, the roar of machinery and voices all around. Hands reached for me, guiding me up and out onto the ice. I blinked against the brightness, making out shapes of people, vehicles, equipment, a full-scale rescue operation. As they laid me on a stretcher, I saw Molly Elliott striding toward me, her characteristic blue commander patches visible on her expedition gear. "Cortez," she said, reaching my side and looking down at me with a mixture of relief and professional assessment. "You look like hell." I tried to smile but wasn't sure if my frozen face cooperated. "Good to see you too, Molly." She turned to the medical team that had converged around me. "Get him to the transport. Priority 1 back to station." As they secured me to the stretcher and began moving me toward a waiting snow vehicle, I caught a last glimpse of the polar diver. The submersible was a mangled, ice-encrusted shadow of its former self, surrounded by heavy equipment and rescue personnel. Above it, the drilling platform they had used to reach me loomed against the Antarctic sky. Next to it was a large hole in the ice, the breach I had created, now widened significantly by the rescue team. I turned away as they loaded me into the transport vehicle. Grant climbed in beside me, and a medic immediately began checking my vital signs and starting an IV. "You found my beacon," I said to Grant as the vehicle's engines roared to life. He nodded. 3 days ago. Took us this long to pinpoint your location and set up the equipment to reach you. We thought..." He paused, emotion briefly crossing his face before his professional demeanor returned. "We thought we were recovering a body." I closed my eyes as the warmth of the transport vehicle began to seep into my frozen limbs, bringing with it waves of pain and exhaustion. "Almost," I murmured. "But not today." The medical facility at the research station was stark and utilitarian, but it felt like luxury after days in the emergency compartment of the polar diver. I lay in a bed surrounded by monitoring equipment, warm air blowing from vents, and actual electric lights overhead. My shoulder had been properly examined, x-rayed, and immobilized. A dislocation, painful, but not permanent. The doctors were more concerned about the hypothermia and dehydration, which they were treating with warmed IV fluids and careful rewarming protocols. Grant and Molly entered the room after the medical team had finished their immediate treatment. They pulled up chairs on either side of my bed. Grant looked relieved but exhausted, dark circles under his eyes suggesting he hadn't slept much during the rescue operation. Molly was as composed as ever, a tablet in her hands, ready for the debriefing I knew was coming. "How are you feeling?" Grant asked, reaching out to briefly squeeze my good hand. "Like I've been chewed up by a prehistoric marine reptile and spit out," I replied, managing a weak smile. "But I'll live." Molly tapped on her tablet. "The doctors say you'll make a full recovery. Your core temperature is almost back to normal, and there's no sign of frostbite in your extremities. Remarkable, considering the conditions." I nodded. The emergency compartment worked as designed. Barely. "We need to talk about what happened," Molly said, getting straight to business. "Your last transmission indicated you were investigating a thermal anomaly. Then nothing for 3 days until your emergency beacon activated." I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts. Despite everything, my researcher's instincts were intact. "I found something, Molly. Something impossible." For the next hour, I detailed everything. The warm current that had pulled the polar diver off course, the tunnel beneath the ice shelf, the vast cavern with its geothermal vents, the prehistoric ecosystem, and the mosasaur. Grant's expression shifted from skepticism to amazement as I spoke. Molly remained impassive, taking notes and occasionally asking for clarification. "I have proof," I said when I'd finished the narrative. "My research equipment kept recording until the power failed. It's all there. Video, temperature readings, atmospheric analysis, everything." Grant looked at Molly. "We recovered his equipment. The data storage units are intact." Molly nodded. "I'll have the technical team start the data recovery immediately." "The ecosystem is gone now," I said, a heaviness settling in my chest that had nothing to do with my physical injuries. When the drill broke through, the ceiling collapsed. Antarctic seawater flooded the cavern. The temperature shock killed everything almost instantly, including the mosasaur. "You had no choice, Adam," Grant said. "It was that or die down there." I nodded. But the conflict inside me remained. I had documented something extraordinary, a pocket of prehistoric life that had somehow survived for millions of years in perfect isolation. And in the act of discovering it, I had destroyed it. The scientist in me mourned the loss of what could have been years, decades of research. The human in me was simply grateful to be alive. "We'll need a comprehensive report," Molly said, all business as usual. "As soon as you're able. The research implications are significant." "I've already been thinking about the preliminary papers," I said. "One on the geothermal anomaly itself. There must be others we haven't detected yet. And another on the mosasaur and the ecosystem. The video footage alone will rewrite what we know about these creatures." Molly stood, tucking her tablet under her arm. "Get some rest, Cortez. We'll talk more when you're stronger." After she left, Grant remained by my bedside. He looked at me with an expression I rarely saw from my pragmatic younger brother: wonder. "A living mosasaur," he said quietly. "If you hadn't recorded it, no one would believe me," I finished. "I know." Over the next few days, as my strength returned, I began the work of organizing my findings. The technical team had successfully recovered all my data, and I spent hours reviewing the footage and readings, making notes, and outlining research papers. My small recovery room gradually transformed into an impromptu office, with printouts of data charts taped to the walls and my laptop constantly running analyses. The footage of the mosasaur was even more impressive when viewed on a proper screen, rather than the polar diver's small console. I watched it repeatedly, studying the creature's movements, behavior patterns, and physical characteristics. I estimated she was about 15 meters long, smaller than the largest mosasaur fossils on record, but still magnificent. The adaptation to the isolated environment was evident in several features, suggesting evolutionary divergence from her ancient ancestors. The thermal vent system was equally fascinating. Preliminary analysis suggested it was part of a previously unknown volcanic system beneath the Ross Ice Shelf, possibly connected to Mount Erebus, but following a different magma channel. The implications for our understanding of Antarctic geothermal activity were enormous. As I worked, the conflicting emotions remained. Every scientific breakthrough came with the knowledge that I had witnessed the end of something unique and irreplaceable. I included this ethical dimension in my notes, determined that my papers would acknowledge both the discovery and its cost. The news of my findings spread quickly through the research station, though Molly had imposed strict confidentiality protocols until the data could be properly verified and prepared for publication. Still, I received visits from curious colleagues, all eager to hear firsthand about the cavern and its prehistoric inhabitant. By the time the doctors cleared me to leave the medical facility, I had completed drafts of 2 preliminary research papers: Thermal Anomalies Beneath the Ross Ice Shelf, Evidence of Uncharted Geothermal Activity, and The Last Mosasaur, Documentation of a Living Specimen and Its Isolated Ecosystem. The titles were clinical and academic, but the content would send shockwaves through the scientific community. I knew that once these papers were published, my discovery would be scrutinized from every angle. There would be skeptics, of course. Claims this extraordinary demanded extraordinary evidence, but I had that evidence, preserved in high-definition video and precise scientific measurements. The mosasaur and her ancient ecosystem were gone, crushed beneath tons of Antarctic ice, but their brief encounter with modern humanity would forever change our understanding of survival, adaptation, and the hidden wonders that might still exist in Earth's most extreme environments.